The cold air hit me first. Then the deadbolt slid shut from inside. I was standing on our front porch barefoot, holding a laundry basket of my own clothes, when Scott turned off the porch light without saying a word. It was 11:58 p.m. My hands were shaking. I knocked once, twice, then harder. "Scott, what is going on?" "Nothing." I stepped back and my bare foot hit something on the step. A plastic envelope with my name written in Scott's handwriting. Inside were divorce papers, already signed on his end, and a typed letter calling me emotionally exhausting and saying I was holding him back. My legs nearly gave way. I sat on the cold step, staring at those words when headlights cut through the dark. A black car pulled into our driveway. A tall woman stepped out, smirking like she had already won. "He said you'd be gone by now," she told me, walking right past with a set of keys. My keys. She let herself into my house and shut the door. That was when I noticed the child's car seat in her back seat. I walked. That was the only thing my body knew how to do. I left the laundry basket on the step and moved down the street barefoot, the pavement rough and cold beneath me. My phone was down to 9% and showed 4 missed calls from numbers I didn't recognize. Not one was from Scott. I had no money for a hotel, no plan, and nowhere to go at midnight. A rideshare driver named Lou spotted me at the corner. He slowed his car and asked if I was okay, and I told him no. He gave me a free ride without asking another question. I spent the whole drive staring at my phone, telling myself not to fall apart. When we pulled up outside my sister Pam's apartment building, my phone buzzed one more time. A new text from one of those unknown numbers. I opened it and read 3 short words that settled in my chest like cold stone. "Did he tell you yet?" Pam opened the door before I could knock twice. She pulled me inside and held me without asking questions, which was the kindest thing anyone had done for me in days. I sat at her kitchen table and told her everything: the locked door, the papers, the woman, the car seat. Pam listened, and when I finished, her face told me she had known something was wrong for a long time. She said Scott had called her twice over the summer asking strange questions about separate living arrangements, as if he had been rehearsing this moment for months. She also admitted she had seen Scott with a tall woman at a gas station about 3 weeks earlier, and had convinced herself it was nothing. My name is Donna. I was 34 years old, 7 years married, and sitting in my sister's kitchen with nothing but a wallet and a phone with a dead battery. Before Pam showed me to the guest room that night, she told me she had found something in Scott's car the last time she borrowed it, a folded piece of paper. A child's drawing. Pam unfolded the drawing on the kitchen table in front of me. It was the kind of thing any small child might make. Round head, stick figure legs, a yellow sun drawn in the corner. But this one had labels written beside each figure in careful, small handwriting. Daddy. Me. And next to a third figure instead of a name there was only a question mark. No mommy. Just a question mark, as if the child had been waiting for an answer that never came. The paper was worn at the creases, folded and unfolded many times. I studied the handwriting on the labels and felt something cold pass through me. I knew that printing. I had seen it on birthday cards and grocery lists and the backs of photographs for 7 years. Those labels had been written by Scott. A child had drawn the picture, and Scott had sat beside that child and written the names, which meant he had been there. Which meant he had been there more than once. The next morning I needed to find money. I had $40 in cash and nothing else. I drove Pam's car to our bank and tried to withdraw funds from our joint savings account. Declined. I tried the joint checking account. Declined. My joint credit card was refused at the ATM before I even finished entering my PIN. I sat in the bank parking lot with both hands on the steering wheel, trying to understand what I was dealing with. I went inside and spoke to a teller who confirmed what I was already beginning to fear. Scott had removed my access from every shared account the previous morning, the morning before he locked me out. He had done it on purpose and in advance. He had planned this carefully and made sure I had nothing to fall back on. I did not have enough money for one night in the cheapest motel in town. The man I had spent 7 years building a life with had made certain I would land with nothing. Pam told me about a legal aid clinic downtown that handled emergency family cases. I went the next morning with the divorce papers in my bag. The attorney there was a composed, careful man named Mr. Harris. He read through every page slowly, and when he looked up, His expression was serious. He told me Scott had actually filed for divorce over a month ago. Not simply signed papers the night he pushed me out. The filing was already moving through the courts. What surprised Mr. Harris most was the address Scott had listed as his own residence on the filing. It was not our house. It was an address on Clover Lane across town. Mr. Harris wrote it down and slid it toward me across the table. I looked at it for a long moment. I did not recognize that address. But something in my chest already knew whose it was before my mind caught up. I left the clinic with the address in my hand and a hollow feeling opening up inside me. I drove past the Clover Lane address before I let myself think too hard about it. A neat apartment building. Flower boxes in the windows. I sat in Pam's car outside for a few minutes, then drove back without getting out. Back at Pam's, I sat with the full weight of all the signs I had ignored. Late nights explained away too easily. A coldness that had crept into Scott's voice over the past year. Evenings when he would take calls in another room and return quieter than before. Once he told me I was too sensitive when I noticed his distance. Another time he said I was creating problems that weren't there. I had believed him each time. I had smoothed things over and told myself that marriages went through difficult stretches. I had spent months trying to rescue something that had already been abandoned. When I returned to Mr. Harris the following morning, he had been going through the documents more carefully overnight. He told me the wording inside the divorce papers was not standard. Mr. Harris laid out 2 sections and explained what was wrong with each. The first demanded I waive all rights to spousal support. The second required me to give up any claim to shared property, including our home. He said neither clause was typical. Then he turned to an earlier draft attached to the filing. At the bottom of that draft was a signature line. Someone had signed my name on it. I stared at the signature and felt the room go still. That was not my handwriting. The letters were wrong. The way the capital D curved in Donna looked nothing like mine. Someone had forged my signature on that earlier draft, most likely to suggest I had already agreed to the terms before any court date. Mr. Harris said nothing for a moment. Then he reached behind the packet and pulled out a separate document that had been quietly attached to the filing. A sealed medical insurance file, still folded inside a plain envelope. He set it on the desk in front of me without opening it yet. Mr. Harris opened the sealed file. Inside were pediatric medical bills, charges for routine visits, a specialist, and follow-up care, all for a child listed as 4 years old. The bills had been paid quietly through Scott's employer insurance plan without a word to me. 4 years old. I did the math immediately. 4 years ago, Scott and I had been married for 3 years. I had been pregnant. I had miscarried that same year. And Scott had held my hand at the hospital and told me we would try again. And during all of that, he had apparently been paying medical bills for someone else's child. The child's first name on the records was Eli. The last name was not Scott's surname. It was his middle name, James. Eli James. Scott's own middle name, used quietly as a last name for a child he had been hiding for 4 years. I sat completely still across the desk from Mr. Harris and did not speak. Everything that had happened to me in the past 3 days had just arranged itself into one clear and devastating picture. That evening I sat in Pam's guest room with my phone and began searching. I looked up the Clover Lane address and found a name connected to it through a local community board listing. Nicole. I searched her name and found a public social media profile she had never thought to lock down. I scrolled slowly, and with each photo another piece of the story clicked into place. There was Scott at a birthday party, holding a small boy near a cake with 4 candles. Scott helping with what looked like a school project at a kitchen table I had never seen. Scott laughing at a backyard cookout, lifting the boy onto his shoulders. He looked relaxed in those pictures, easy and present in a way he had not been with me in years. I kept scrolling until I stopped on one particular photo. Scott was sitting on a park bench with his arm around Nicole, the boy playing nearby in the grass. On Scott's left wrist, catching the afternoon light, was my father's watch. The one I had placed on Scott's wrist myself at our 5th anniversary dinner, the year my father died. I put my phone face down on the bed and sat in the dark for a long time. My father had given me that watch when he knew he was sick. I had placed it on Scott's wrist because I trusted him with the things that mattered most to me. Seeing it in that park photo, on his wrist in her photograph, beside a child I never knew existed, broke something in me that the divorce papers alone had not managed to reach. I let myself feel it fully. Then I stopped. I had spent 3 days being the person things happened to. I was done with that. I got up, borrowed Pam's laptop, and spent 2 hours going through every joint account statement I could still access, moving through them year by year. I went back 4 years and worked through every line. Near the bottom of a statement from 4 years earlier, made during the same month I had miscarried, I found a charge I did not recognize. A company name I had never seen before. A payment for a service Scott had never once mentioned to me. The charge came from a private DNA testing company. It had been made 4 years ago, just days after I lost our baby. Scott had quietly ordered a paternity test that same week, paid for it from our joint account, and said nothing to me. He had gone to confirm another child was his while I was still recovering from losing ours. I sat with that for a long moment. Then I got up, drove to a pharmacy, and bought a home DNA testing kit. I mailed it anonymously to Nicole's address on Clover Lane with a short note asking her to use it on her son, and return it in the prepaid envelope I included. I did not tell her who I was. I did not know if she would respond. I only knew I needed something solid enough to stand up anywhere it needed to. 7 days passed. Then, on a quiet Tuesday afternoon, my phone showed a new message from an unknown number. I opened it. 3 words filled the screen. "We need to talk." Nicole and I met at a coffee shop far from both our neighborhoods. She arrived first and sat with her hands wrapped around a mug, looking nothing like the smirking woman I had seen on my porch. She looked tired and uncertain, and I recognized that immediately. She spoke first. She told me Scott had said his divorce was finalized before they ever met. She had believed she was the only woman in his life. She had believed they were building something real together. She had never been told about me, and I had never been told about her. We had both been kept completely separate on purpose for years. I could see she was telling the truth. When I told her our marriage had been ongoing the entire time, her face went through something I recognized. The same hollow disbelief I had felt standing barefoot on my front step. Before we finished our coffee, she slid her phone across the table. She showed me screenshots of messages between her and Scott. In one of them, Scott had written that Eli wasn't part of the plan. Nicole and I spent 2 hours laying everything out between us. She showed me dates. I showed her account statements. Together we mapped out the timeline, and it was worse than either of us had understood alone. Scott had been running both lives at the same time for over 4 years, moving between us, using money from our marriage to fund his life with her. Eli's medical bills, his birthday gatherings, the furniture in that Clover Lane apartment, all of it had been paid using money that was partly mine. Nicole had believed Scott was using his own savings. She had not known about me, and I had not known about her. We were 2 halves of a lie that had been kept carefully apart. Near the end of our meeting, Nicole said there was one more thing she wanted to tell me. She said Scott had once mentioned very casually that he kept a separate bank account, one that no one knew about. He had called it, without seeming to think much of it, his exit fund. Mr. Harris connected me with a forensic accountant who reviewed our business records within 3 days. They found the account. It had been opened roughly 4 years ago, close to the same time Scott had ordered the paternity test. Small amounts had been moved into it regularly from our shared event coordination business, the company that carried both our names. The transfers were never large enough to raise immediate concern, but over 4 years they had added up to a significant sum. What made the situation more dangerous was how the account had been registered. It listed both our names as co-owners, but my signature on the opening documents was forged. Mr. Harris told me this created a legal risk for me. If the account surfaced in the wrong way before we controlled the narrative, it could appear that I had been involved. Scott had not only stolen from me, he had arranged the paperwork so that if things collapsed, I could be pulled down alongside him. Then, reviewing the account's most recent activity, I found one specific transaction dated 48 hours before he locked me out of our home. The transaction was a transfer of $15,000. It had been moved to cover the deposit and first 2 months of rent on Nicole's Clover Lane apartment. What made it deliberate was the structure of the lease paperwork. Nicole's rental application listed a cosigner. My name. My name had been signed onto her lease without my knowledge. Combined with the drained joint accounts and the address change on the divorce filing, The full picture became clear. Scott had spent months building a specific story. In that story, I had quietly agreed to the separation, helped Nicole settle into her new place, and walked away on my own terms. He had arranged it so that if I tried to fight back, it would appear I had already consented to everything. Every move had been designed to make my resistance look unreasonable. When I laid all of this in front of Mr. Harris and watched him go through it page by page, he was quiet for a long moment. Then he looked up with something close to a hard, steady smile. "With this," he said, "we can destroy him." The DNA results arrived 10 days after I mailed the kit. I opened the envelope at Pam's kitchen table with Mr. Harris on the phone. The results confirmed what I had already known in my gut. Scott was Eli's biological father, with a stated probability of 99.98%. I held the page and felt something inside me settle. This was the piece that made everything else permanent. But there was a second page attached. A section titled, Notable Genetic Markers. The report identified a hereditary cardiac condition present in the sample. It was manageable with proper monitoring, but it required disclosure in certain professional and legal settings. I read the section twice. Then I called Mr. Harris back and read it aloud to him. He went quiet on the other end of the line. Then he asked me one careful question. "Does Scott currently have a significant business deal in negotiation?" I thought about it. He did. Scott's company had been working toward a contract with a regional healthcare group for nearly a year. Mr. Harris told me to find out everything I could about it. I still had access to our shared business email archive as co-owner. I searched it carefully that evening and found that the healthcare contract was far more advanced than I had realized. The deal required full medical and ethics disclosures from both parties before any agreement could be signed. The healthcare group's terms were clear. Any undisclosed liability or relevant personal matter had to be declared in advance without exception. I found Scott's completed disclosure form in the archive. He had declared nothing beyond a routine annual physical. No dependent child. No pending divorce. No hidden accounts. Every omission was a direct violation of the contract's stated terms. Scott had no idea the DNA test existed. He had no idea a genetic marker was now part of a documented paper trail connected directly to his name. He had been meticulous about every other detail but had never once imagined I would find Nicole, sit across from her at a coffee shop and send that kit. 2 days later, an email arrived in my inbox addressed to Scott's business attorney. It had been forwarded to me by mistake. It contained the contract's full confidentiality clause. Mr. Harris spent 3 days going through everything: the DNA results, the genetic marker disclosure, the forged lease paperwork, the hidden account, the business emails, and the contract clause. When he called me on a Thursday morning, he said we had something uncommon, a case where every piece of evidence connected cleanly to the next. The forged signatures established fraud. The hidden accounts established financial misconduct. The undisclosed paternity and genetic record created a contract violation that would end the healthcare deal. The lease paperwork tied it all together as part of a deliberate plan to deceive me. Mr. Harris said we were ready to file and that when we did, things would move quickly. I felt a shift inside me. Not quite relief, but something like readiness. I had stopped being afraid somewhere between the DNA results and the contract email. I was ready to end this. We scheduled the court date for the following Tuesday. Then that Saturday night just before midnight, I heard hard knocking at Pam's front door. I looked through the peephole. Scott stood outside, his face tight, pounding with his fist. Pam stepped back and I opened the door myself. Scott's eyes were red and his jaw was clenched hard. He pushed a copy of the divorce papers toward me and told me to stop making things complicated and just sign them. I let him speak until he was finished. Then I told him I knew about Eli. I watched the color leave his face in one quick wave. I told him I knew about Nicole's lease. I told him about the forged signatures on the divorce draft and the business account paperwork. His expression moved through shock, then anger, then something that looked very close to panic. "You can't prove any of that," he said. I told him I wasn't there to argue about it tonight. I had a lawyer and a court date already scheduled. He stared at me and breathed hard. And then the kind of moment happened that only comes when someone forgets to stay careful. His voice dropped and he said it without thinking. "You weren't supposed to find any of that." He caught himself immediately and looked away. But it was already out. I had heard it. Pam, standing 2 feet behind me, had heard it too. The courtroom was small and very still. I sat beside Mr. Harris on Tuesday morning with a folder containing 4 years of Scott's double life, organized into clear and careful order. Scott arrived with his own attorney, a man who looked underprepared and kept flipping through pages even after the session began. Mr. Harris presented our case methodically. First, the forged signatures on the divorce draft and the business account opening documents. Then the hidden account and its direct connection to the healthcare contract's disclosure requirements. Then the lease paperwork listing my forged name as co-signer. Finally, the DNA results and the genetic marker documentation, and what Scott's omission of both meant for the ethics forms he had already submitted. The judge was a composed woman who did not react to anything dramatically. But I noticed the exact moment her expression shifted, a slight stillness, a pause before she turned to the next page of the evidence. Scott sat rigid across the room, staring at the table. Then the door at the back of the courtroom opened quietly. Footsteps moved down the aisle. Nicole sat down in the row directly behind me. The judge took her time. Then she spoke. All shared accounts and business holdings were to be frozen immediately, pending full investigation. She flagged the forged documents and the undisclosed paternity as particularly serious matters. The healthcare group had been notified of the pending legal action the previous day and had formally withdrawn from the contract by that afternoon, citing Scott's failure to disclose relevant personal and financial matters in his ethics submission. Without that contract, Scott's company had no way to cover its outstanding costs. His business partner dissolved their arrangement in writing 2 days later. 3 staff members resigned within the week. His income, his contract, and his professional standing collapsed inside 5 days. As a final order, the judge awarded me temporary management authority over the shared business until the full hearing could be scheduled. I walked out of that courtroom holding more control over our shared assets than I had ever been permitted to exercise during the marriage. On the way out, Scott's attorney leaned close and whispered something quietly into Scott's ear. Scott went completely still, his face pale, while everyone else filed out around him. The full hearing came 6 weeks later. Mr. Harris walked in with everything in order. Scott had changed legal representation twice during the intervening weeks as the case expanded, and it showed in how his new attorney struggled to keep up. The final judgment was thorough. I was awarded the majority of our marital assets. I received full spousal support for a period of 5 years. Ownership of the shared business transferred entirely into my name. A restraining order was issued preventing Scott from contacting me or accessing any property connected to my name. Scott was left with his personal accounts, which had been heavily reduced by weeks of legal fees, and the cost of legally unwinding the fraudulent business account. He walked out of court with debt and no company. After the hearing closed, I was collecting documents at the table when I overheard Scott's attorney speaking to him in a low and serious voice. The attorney told him that the forged signatures and the account fraud had been formally referred to the district attorney's office. Criminal charges were being reviewed. I gathered my papers, thanked Mr. Harris, and walked out without looking back. The weeks that followed were the quietest I had known in my adult life, and I mean that as the best possible thing. I signed a lease on a small apartment 3 miles from Pam's place and moved my things in over a single afternoon. I opened a new bank account in only my name and began rebuilding the business with the help of a trusted former client who had always believed in the work. Nicole had filed her own legal action against Scott after the hearing, and from what Pam heard through mutual contacts, she and Eli had moved out of the Clover Lane apartment and gone to stay with Nicole's mother out of state. Scott sold his car to cover an outstanding legal bill. His professional contacts had grown scarce, and several business doors had quietly closed after the court proceedings appeared in a local business brief. About 3 weeks after the final hearing, I came home to find an envelope slipped under my apartment door. No return address, just my name on the front. I opened it and sat down on the floor right there in the hallway, because I recognized the handwriting immediately. It was from Scott. He was asking me to forgive him. I did not write back to Scott. I held the letter for a moment, then folded it and placed it in the file alongside all the other evidence, not out of spite, but because that was where it belonged with everything else that had happened. I responded instead to the court, signing the final paperwork and closing out the last remaining accounts. The business was already gaining ground. I had brought in 2 new clients in my first month of sole ownership and hired a part-time assistant. I was building something that was entirely mine. No hidden clauses, no forged names buried in the documents, nothing that didn't belong to me. The woman who had sat on a cold porch step at midnight with a basket of clothes and a phone on 9% was still me. But she was not all I was anymore. A few weeks after the final hearing, I drove past a donation shelter a few blocks from what used to be our house, from what was now legally mine. I had 3 boxes of Scott's old clothes in the back seat, things he had left behind. I dropped them at the shelter door, signed the receipt and drove home. He had left me with nothing at midnight. I left his things in the morning light with everything.